So welcome everybody to another episode of Take Note, the place to be to make the most of your non-ordinary transcendent experiences. I'm Dr. Nicole Gruhl, and today I have the great honor and privilege of inviting Dr. Yvonne Kason in as our special guest. So I've been looking forward to this interview for a long time, I must tell you all. Yvonne, welcome to Take Note.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Great. So for those who have not yet come across Dr. Yvonne Kason's work, she is an author, speaker, retired family physician, transpersonal MD-psychotherapist, and professor of the University of Toronto, I believe it was.
Previously, before my retirement.
Previously.
I taught at the University of Toronto, yes.
Wonderful. So we have with us someone who has an enormous array of professional background and perspective, which we're hoping to bring in today. But most importantly, Yvonne is an experiencer of numerous spiritually transformative experiences, including incredibly 4 near-death experiences, which we will hear about today. And she is also the lady who coined the term spiritually transformative experience. So truly, Yvonne, it is an honor to have you here. Welcome. And I'm looking forward to this deep dive.
Thank you.
So, wow, where to begin? Today's topic is around the gifts of STEs. And I guess I'd love to hear about you coined this term, spiritually transformative experience. So how did that even come about?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, it was a process, me coming up with this term, spiritually transformative experiences. It all began really when I was in medical school. When I was a medical student, I took a course in meditation, and it was supposed to help you relax for your exams so that you get better marks in your exams and study a bit better. And so I was really meditating, not so much that I was trying to have a spiritual experience, but to calm and to study for my exams in medical school. This was my last year in medical school. Well, I had a profound experience a few months after I started meditating. I now know that it was a Kundalini awakening. Back then, I had no idea what had happened to me. I'll just take a moment now and tell you about that experience very quickly. It's quite brief, but imagine me, I'm a young medical student thinking I'm going to be a traditional medical doctor. I'm meditating to be calm and relaxed. And so while I was meditating, all of a sudden, I heard a loud rushing, sort of roaring noise. Roar, rush. Hard to replicate the noise, but it was sort of a rushing, roaring noise. And then I felt this rush of energy rush up my body, like my back, my whole body, this rush of energy with this roar. And then all of a sudden, me, or what I thought was me, was no longer inside of the confines of my body. I had expanded to this vast size, maybe the size of the auditorium that I was in, and I had transformed into pure love. So I felt like my essence had transformed into pure, profound, powerful love. And I stayed in that expansive state of love for the duration of my meditation. It was a group meditation, maybe an hour or so. And then when my meditation ended and I opened my eyes, this went away. But because I didn't know any better, I thought, wow, no wonder people like to meditate. This is incredible. And I thought that all the more experienced people were having this all the time. And I never told anybody because I was embarrassed, like, oh my gosh, it took me a few months to figure out how to meditate right. But when I couldn't replicate this, when I went for, my future meditations, because I was meditating every day already at that time, I started, after a few weeks, I asked somebody, what am I doing wrong in my meditation? Why am I not having that incredible love expansion experience? And then this person said to me, gee, Yvonne, that sounds a bit like a Kundalini awakening, but I don't think Kundalini awakening happens to average people. So no, must be something else. And I sort of explored, a few people I asked, could this be a Kundalini? Everybody definitely told me no. There was no possibility this could be a Kundalini awakening, because Kundalini awakening only happened to people who were like really advanced and have been meditating for many, many years, or it could only happen in the presence of a guru. And all of these reasons, I was told it was not a Kundalini awakening. So I didn't know what it was. So I was reading about Kundalini and I thought, gee, it sort of sounds like what they talk about when, I got to know Gopi Krishna. Synchronistically, I traveled to India and met Gopi Krishna a couple of years before this. So I was reading all of Gopi Krishna's books and I thought, even though I haven't been meditating for 30 years and I haven't been under a guru this lifetime, I think I've had a Kundalini awakening. But that was sort of a secret I kept locked inside because that was so far out of the medical box.
Yeah.
And so that's when I'm still in medical school. So you must imagine, this is the first secret in my box. Well,
boy, were you getting a real education.
That's right. I figure spirit was giving me my spiritual training while the university was giving me my medical training. Yes. When I look back, that's really how I look at it. So I didn't realize that spirit had a plan for me to specialize in spiritually transformative experiences, but they were showing me firsthand what my work was going to be about. So then a couple years later, 3 years later, actually, when I was finishing medical school, finishing my residency, I was now a resident. I was a young doctor. I had what I now know is a near-death experience. But again, at the time, I did not know it was a near-death experience. So I'll take a moment now and tell you the story of my near-death experience I had when I was in my last year of my medical residency. So yeah, Kundalini awakening, last year of medical school, and near-death experience, last year of my residency training.
Wow.
Do you see a plan? Anyway, so I was assigned that day. I was a young doctor, and I was assigned to accompany a critically ill patient on a medical evacuation by airplane. And this was in northern Ontario in a very, very remote area. So this is a remote forested area. And this small airplane, this was winter, March 27th, 1979. This is winter in Canada, so very cold. We flew into bad weather, into a blizzard. The twin engine airplane got into engine trouble and crashed. So as the plane was going down, as it was crashing, there was severe turbulence. Like, trust me, you don't miss it if a plane is crashing. You get really, really bad air turbulence. So you know the plane is crashing. And my immediate reaction, like an instinct, my soul just went, oh God, I'm going to die, help. And it seemed like that, like reaction plea, even though it wasn't like a fancy prayer or anything, was enough, because immediately after that went out of my soul is when my near-death experience began, even before the plane had crashed. So all of a sudden, I felt this force field of peace. It was like it descended upon me. And as it descended upon me, it pushed away all my fear. And I felt perfectly still, perfectly calm, totally unafraid. And then I heard an inner voice. And prior to this time, I'd never heard an inner voice before. So this was totally new for me. And this inner voice said in a very strong, comforting vibration, be still and know that I am God. I am with you now and always. And with those words, this vibration just penetrated my soul. The vibration of peace, the vibration of the presence of the divine. Now, the plane had not crashed yet. I was still in the plane. I turned, I started comforting the patient who'd regained consciousness. I was saying to her, don't worry, everything's going to be all right. And I knew everything was going to be all right, whether we lived or died, because I had this profound spiritual presence engulfing me and permeating me. Anyway, the pilot heroically managed to bring the plane down onto the surface of a semi-frozen lake. But unfortunately, when the weight of the plane settled on the lake, the ice broke and the plane sank really quickly. I managed to get out of the plane, but I was unable to get the patient out of the plane before it sank into very deep water. So there I found myself in a lake in the middle of winter, and there was perhaps 200 yards between me and the closest shore, which was an island. And this was dark, fast-moving water, and it was cold. It was winter. It was in a blizzard, in a storm. I was wearing a heavy coat and boots, and they were sinking with the water, just pulling me into the water. And the pilot was shouting out, try to get on the ice, try to get on the ice, because going the other direction, there was some ice. But the voice in my head insisted, swim to shore. So after a couple attempts to get on the ice, the voice insisted repeatedly, swim to shore. And I finally surrendered to that higher wisdom and started swimming to shore. Now, that was a really long and a really difficult swim. Some people say that's a miracle, even that I was able to swim that distance in winter and the current with my coat on. But anyway, I did, through the grace of God. But it was a struggle, and I went under several times. And somewhere in the process of swimming to shore is where my near-death experience deepened. All of a sudden, I heard a whooshing noise again, and whoosh. And it seemed like my point of perception was whisked out of my body. And suddenly I was perhaps 20 or so feet above my body, looking down. Now, my body was still alive. My body was still swimming to shore. But my point of perception was now 20 feet or so above my body. But it was sort of, sometimes I compare it to a split screen TV, where you have a big picture and then a tiny little picture. It was as if the tiny little picture, a tiny little bit of my consciousness was still in my physical body. But the vast majority of my consciousness was up in this expansive place where I'd gone outside of my body. Now, or we could say I was at two places at the same time. We can play with interpretations, but that is the best that I can explain.
I love the split screen description. That works so well.
Good. Okay. So there was this little finger of my consciousness that was still working the body, but the majority of my consciousness had risen out of my body. And where I rose to was this expansive place that was filled with love and was filled with light. Now, many people talk about the light. Yes, it was filled with light. But the most powerful thing for me was the love. The love was so strong, so powerful. It was pure, unconditional love. And I felt home. I felt totally embraced, totally accepted, totally loved by the higher power behind the universe. I didn't hear words explaining it to me. I just knew somehow in my soul that that I was experiencing a glimpse of, I was feeling the love of the higher power behind the universe. And I knew at the same time that this higher power was infinitely intelligent and infinitely wide, big, encompassing all of creation. And I knew that there was nothing to fear in death, that what I think of as me would continue to live on, whether or not my body that was struggling down below survived swimming to shore or not. It was the most profoundly beautiful experience I had ever had. So while in this state of, I will call it ecstasy, love, bliss, expansion, I watched as my body struggled to swim to shore, but sort of in a detached way. Mm-hmm. It's like if you're watching a TV show and you know that the ending's already been written, so you're not really invested in which way it ends. You're just curious to see which way it ends, because I really didn't care which way it was going to end. And there was also this sense that the divine already knew what was going to happen. So I was watching a show that was sort of already preordained to see what the outcome's going to be on the little part of the split screen. So it looked like I was going to drown, because my body was exhausted and about to go under for the third and final time. And I remember at that instant, it's as if the split screen split, and more of my consciousness now was down in my physical body and only a little bit up in the light as I was about to go down for the final time. And I remember looking at the shore. I was still about 20 feet away or so. But I just had no strength left. I could not swim any further. And the current was carrying me very rapidly to the right. And I remember thinking, gee, it's true. You do die the third time you go down. I mean, it's amazing the thoughts you get. But that's what I thought. And I was ready. I just completely was surrendering to the light, to death. And then at that instant, I saw through my eyes of my physical body that the current was carrying me rapidly to the right. There was a tall pine tree that had fallen into the lake off the shore of the island. And in that paranormal state that I was in, it appeared to me as if an etheric hand of light was superimposed on that tree, and it was reaching out to me. So all I had to do was somehow swim just a couple more strokes, and the current would carry me to that tree. And that is exactly what happened. And somehow when I got to that tree, I managed to pull myself on shore. I called to the other two who were still in the water, swim to shore, swim to shore. And then I crouched instinctively to try and keep as warm as I could, because I was freezing to death. And then I floated above my body. Now, there are a lot of details about the heroic rescue, and people who want to read about it can read about it in my book. I'm going to skip now to when my consciousness re-entered my body. Yes, that's the book.
This is the one. Yes.
I go into a lot of detail about the amazing heroism and the amazing coincidences that led to my rescue. That is, if you believe in coincidences. But Spirit orchestrated a number of coincidences that led to my rescue. Anyway, I was rescued by helicopter and brought to a nearby hospital, and wheeled on a stretcher into the emergency department. And I remember watching from above as the nurses were trying to take my temperature and were puzzled because they couldn't get a reading on their thermometer. You know, they're studying their thermometer. But I was so hypothermic, so frozen, that my body temperature was below the bottom reading of their standard thermometer. And as I watched, I know. Oh. And so as I watched, I felt my consciousness start to shift further and further away from my body. And I knew that I was dying, and I was fine. And all of a sudden, I heard a voice say, "Boy, could I use a hot bath." And I was surprised to realize that my physical body had spoken those words. Like I hadn't thought of it, but somehow my physical body said, "Boy, could I use a hot bath." And then the nurses looked at each other and sort of said, hey, maybe that would help them. Maybe we should bring them down to the physiotherapy department, put them in the hot whirlpool baths. And in fact, that is what my body needed. And so they finally took me in there, took my ice-encrusted clothes off, put me in that hot whirlpool bath. And it was in the heat when my body was being rewarmed that I felt my consciousness re-enter my body. And what that felt like was like this. It was like really fast and really sudden. I'm up here in this expansive place, and suddenly, with a whooshing noise again, I'm sucked down, it seems, through the top of my head into my body. And suddenly I'm back. And I remember rubbing my arms and rubbing my legs, saying, I'm back, I'm going to live. The nurses probably wrote confused or delirious or something in their medical notes. But no, I was not confused or delirious. Wow. I was back in my body. I had lived. So after this experience, when I went back to my work as a young doctor, I talked with my medical colleagues about this. Had anyone heard of an experience like this? I mean, what is this called? And so my medical colleagues, they all knew I wasn't crazy or flaky or anything like that, but they listened very carefully, and everybody came up with a medical hypothesis that basically it was a hallucination brought on maybe by hypothermia, or maybe by an electrolyte imbalance, or maybe by a low blood sugar. And, you know, I had seen people with low blood sugar, and I had seen people with electrolyte imbalances. Nobody described an experience like this. So it just didn't resonate with me that that's all that it was, to dismiss it as a hallucination, because it had impacted me profoundly. I had absolutely lost my fear of death. I absolutely knew in the reality of the higher power. And the higher power was not an old man sitting on a throne with a long white beard like I'd been taught, but was this universal force of love and intelligence. And I became like love intoxicated. I was just oozing love and oozing joy after this happened. I took great joy in seeing children playing. I would have tears streaming down my cheeks when I would see the squirrels running in the yard. And it just, I had love for everybody, and any music that was about God or about children or about love would just move me. And I was so filled with love. I was like overflowing with love. I thought, this is no electrolyte imbalance. Something very, very powerful has happened to me. So I kept looking to try and find even a word to describe what had happened to me. I did talk to somebody who claimed to know stuff about near-death experiences, but they told me, oh no, this is not a near-death experience, Yvonne, because you were never dead. And also because you did not go through a tunnel to the light. And so I didn't know any better. So I thought, okay, I guess it's not a near-death experience. So what is it then? So I kept on looking. And then one of my doctor friends was the only person who gave me an explanation that seemed to fit at that point. He was a devout Christian, and he said to me, you know what, Yvonne? I think you've had a mystical experience. And finally, I felt that resonates with my soul, a mystical experience. So I started as a young doctor. I was doing traditional family practice, and I was training in MD-psychotherapy additionally. But I secretly, on the side, my secret passion became meditating, of course, reading spiritual books, reading about Kundalini, everything I could get my hands on about Kundalini, because I thought I was undergoing Kundalini awakening, which I was, and everything I could read about mystical experiences. I also read about near-death experiences. And then shortly after this near-death experience, which I now know is a near-death experience, but then I called it a mystical experience in the plane crash, a few weeks afterwards, I had a psychic awakening, my very first powerful clairvoyant experience. I was driving home from work one night, and I was going to visit a friend, and partway to her house, I was just stopped at an intersection in my car at a red light, and all of a sudden in my mind's eye, I got this crystal clear image of my friend's brain covered in pus. Now, me as a medical doctor, it was a perfectly clear depiction. I knew immediately it was meningitis. It was a picture that depicted meningitis. And when I got to my friend's house, I asked her, how are you feeling? And she said, gee, Yvonne, I haven't been feeling well all day. I have this strange headache. Anyway, to make a long story short, she was diagnosed with meningitis later that night and treated and recovered completely, thank goodness. So now I added to my list of things that I was researching because I was experiencing it was, psychic experiences. And I thought, how are these things connected? I mean, why would I suddenly have a Kundalini awakening and then a near-death experience with a mystical experience and then a psychic awakening? there must be some sort of connection between all of these. And as I said to you, I had the great privilege and honor of meeting and knowing Gopi Krishna and reading all of his works. And he, of course, had postulated that according to yogic theory, these are all connected. They're all part of evolving consciousness, that the spiritual energy Kundalini mechanism can awaken, and that people can have mystical experiences, they can have psychic phenomenon, and they can have many spiritual energy phenomena related to Kundalini. So I kept this secret. It was like I was leading a double life for 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
But it's hard. It's hard to keep a secret like this. People started finding me. People started coming out of the woodwork. They heard there was this doctor in Toronto who would listen to you if you've had some sort of paranormal experience, because she's had some too. I don't know how the word got out by the grapevine, but it did. So gradually over the years, more and more people started coming to see me in my office because they wanted to talk to me about their spiritual experiences, to finally find a doctor who wouldn't label it as crazy or a hallucination, but give them another name for it. And I found, yes, I could tell them, you've had a mystical experience, or you've had a clairvoyant experience, or you've had a near-death experience, or you've had a Kundalini experience. And people were so grateful. So I came to a place, it happened in 1990. I was invited to go to the Spiritual Emergence Network conference in California, Monterey, California. They were doing a conference on Kundalini awakening. And so the word had gotten around a little bit that I knew Gopi Krishna, and he had mentored me, and I had some experience in Kundalini awakening. And I had been invited to speak at this conference in California. So when I was at the Spiritual Emergence Network conference in Monterey, California, those of us who were professionals at the conference talking about Kundalini and what the symptoms are and what our spiritual experience, our clinical experience was with it, we didn't know if any experiencers would be coming to this conference too, or if it would just be other healthcare providers who wanted to learn about Kundalini. But we thought, oh, let's just put an announcement just in case there are any experiencers here, that we'll have an evening if experiencers want to get together, and then a few of us will be there to talk with them and facilitate whatever. Well, unbelievably, I can't even remember how many people came, but let's say 80. It was a large number of people. And so myself and the other facilitators that were there, we divided the group. I had a group of about 20 people that I was facilitating. And I started out by telling them that I've had a Kundalini awakening and I'm a medical doctor and I know it's not crazy. Then everyone in turn in the group was telling me about their stories. We're sharing with the group. And the horror stories that I heard just cut me to the quick. They just cut me to the quick. People being institutionalized, repeatedly institutionalized, medicated, electroshock therapy. Their churches telling them it's work of the devil. Their doctors telling them, they have to go on psychiatric medications. Just horror stories. And so many people were in tears of gratitude to finally meet a medical doctor who would listen to their story, would validate that it's a Kundalini awakening, and would not immediately tell them they were crazy. I was so moved by this experience. It moved me to the quick of my being. And I went out after that sharing. It was an evening, and there are sand dunes in Monterey. I was walking out in the sand dunes by the ocean. And I had a profound experience on those sand dunes. I call it my calling mystical experience. Suddenly, it was like my consciousness split open and my head became this beacon of light. And I could feel and taste the amrita, like the ambrosia dripping. And in this ball of light that my consciousness became, it's not that words were spoken. I just knew. It was like a revelation. I knew to the core of my being what I must do. I must come out of the closet now. I have a moral obligation to speak up and say, I am a medical doctor. I've had a near-death experience. I am not crazy. Those people out there having near-death experiences, they are not crazy either. And there are other experiences. There are mystical experiences. There are Kundalini awakening experiences. There are psychic experiences. These people are not crazy, and medical profession, me being one of them, have been doing a tremendous disservice by mislabeling these people as crazy. So that was my calling. I knew I'd been called by Spirit. This was now my life work. So my in the closet life ended, and I merged it with my professional life. And of course, when something like this happens, if it's meant to be, Spirit opens the doors. And immediately after I returned to Toronto after that conference, I just started telling everyone I knew that I was specializing in counseling people who'd had spiritual experiences. And everybody, oh, tell me about it. Tell me about it. Oh, talk to us about it. Talk at our conference about it. Oh, would you like to be interviewed for the Toronto Star? Oh, would you like to be interviewed on the radio? Would you like to be interviewed on TV? So it mushroomed. And at that 1990 meeting, I don't want to leave this point out, I and Dr. Bonnie Greenwell and some other members who were present at that conference, we collaboratively founded the Kundalini Research Network because we felt it was really imperative that doctors, psychologists, therapists, healthcare providers need to be aware of Kundalini, of the whole gamut of experiences. Kundalini awakening was the one that there was the very least awareness of in the West. So since that point, my career was focused on counseling people with diverse types of spiritual experiences. Now, the question you asked me, and this was my very long-winded answer, was why I coined the phrase, or how I came to coin the term spiritually transformative experiences. So when I started counseling people and I opened up the Spiritual Emergence Research and Referral Clinic at the University of Toronto, and I was the Canadian coordinator for the Spiritual Emergence Network. So the term spiritual emergence was being used, spiritual emergency was being used, near-death experience was being used, Kundalini awakening was being used. Other people were saying exceptional human experiences was a term that was being used. Experienced anomalous trauma was another term that was being used. So there were all these different terms that were being used, and experiences were being studied independently. Like there's a group over here looking at Kundalini. There's a group over here looking at psychic phenomenon. There's a group over here looking at near-death experiences. But I felt they're all connected. We need an umbrella term that links these together, because they all tend to change people in a very similar way. And these powerful experiences also seem to start or accelerate a long-term transformation in the person having them, what I call spiritual transformation of consciousness. But it has physical symptoms as well as psychological symptoms, as well as spiritual and paranormal symptoms. So then the term came to my consciousness, spiritually transformative experiences. So in 1994, in my earlier version of this book, I elaborate on it in Farther Shores. In my earlier version, which came up in 1994, which was called A Farther Shore, I first coined the phrase spiritually transformative experiences as an umbrella phrase that will sort of encompass all of these types of powerful spiritual experiences that transform people in a very similar way.
And for those who have not come across this amazing book yet, I think that's one of the things I really love the most about this, Yvonne, and why it's become a go-to book. I mean, can you see my notes in this? I have things,
That's wonderful.
right, and highlights all, I have scribbles all through it. Because it's a very practical manual. The way that you break down the physical, the mental, you know, these different components of short-term and long-term changes that can occur. It's like there are checklists in here
Yes.
of where you can really, you know, have a self-reflective tool and go through and clearly define what, you know, as an experiencer, you can ask yourself, what happened to me? Did this happen? Did that happen? Or as a practitioner working with experiencers, you really have something to go to and say, oh, here's the checklist for what has occurred with them. And I guess that's why I'm so grateful for your medical background that helps make this such a grounded text. You know, it is fluff free. It
Mhm.
really is. Well, and I think
Thank you.
yeah, because it's one of the, I mean, there's so much wisdom and knowledge in a lot of the texts that are out there. But this book has gone a step further in grounding it in really sensible, practical, human language that we can use to communicate symptoms, and you call them symptoms as
Yeah.
well. So yes, it is like consulting a doctor.
Well, you are. You're consulting me when you read that
Yes.
book. Well, that's exactly what I wanted it to be. I wanted it to be a guide for people who are having STEs. So even if you live in some remote corner of the world where you're not able to access a doctor or therapist who knows a thing about Kundalini or mystical experiences or psychic experiences, that you have a book that you can look and say, yes, that is what is happening to me. So it's a guide for STE experiencers. But it's also, you know, my other goal was to help educate the general public, and also for their healthcare providers, for doctors and for counselors and for life coaches, psychologists, that they can hopefully, from my experience, now I have about 38 years experience counseling people with STEs, in addition to my own personal experiences. So I've learned from the outside and from the inside. You know, I tried to share that in my books so that hopefully it'll help other therapists and counselors help their patients too.
And it's such an important point. I speak to many experiencers also who, like that round table that you had, have horrific stories
Yes.
about what has occurred. There's a lot of beautiful things that have happened, and there are the stories that are very painful, especially people who have been institutionalized, sometimes
Yes.
against their will, medicated,
Yeah.
long-term. So that was several decades ago that you were having that conversation and doing that work then. And here we are now. And I kind of wonder, has much changed? Where are we at with the medical world? How can we do
Yeah.
better with all of this? And really, from an experiencer's point of view, how can an experiencer navigate a sometimes unfriendly, even hostile medical system?
Mhm. Well, I think it's much better than it used to be. I must say, over the years, I have spoken to many, many, many medical audiences about spiritually transformative experiences. So this is in Canada, in the United States, in Europe. But, you know, the problem is generally only those who are interested come to particular seminars. So there are still those who, oh, they're not interested in that, so they don't go to that particular seminar. Well, the other thing we have going in the favor of STE experiencers is the media.
Mm.
Because through the media, through movies, through television and documentaries, and through the YouTube, like what you're doing right now, there's a lot more awareness all around the world about the realities of STEs. Let's just take a very famous movie, Star Wars. Okay, I'm a big fan of George Lucas because
Right.
he puts STEs in his movies, and he did a really great job. And so, for example, I think it's one of the episodes anyway, Luke has a near-death experience where he sees he gets a message from the being of light telling him that he's supposed to go to this remote planet and find Yoda, who is going to train him to be a Jedi. So this was a near-death experience and beautifully depicted. And then we have mystical visions where we're seeing beings of light, people who are ascended on the other side. That happens there. There's all sorts of psychic phenomenon that happen in Star Wars. Now, people might say, oh, that's only a movie and it only happens there, but it's planted the seed that this can happen. It doesn't happen only in Star Wars. It happens really. And then there are other movies like Flatliners where people are trying to have near-death experiences. And then many movies now reenacting the stories of people who've had near-death experiences. My near-death experiences have been reenacted a couple of times, once on an episode of Sightings in the United States. So there is a lot of awareness in the media. And I think that doctors and psychologists are sometimes not getting it from their training, but they're getting it from the media, and actually they're getting it from their patients. And what I recommend is if somebody is an STE experiencer and they feel that they want to get some support in the medical system, but they're not finding somebody who is knowledgeable at all about STEs, there's two different things they can do. One is they can get a copy of my book and give it to their healthcare provider. I've had several people tell me that they did that, to just say, look at chapter 6 there on Kundalini. I think that's what I'm experiencing. This is written by a doctor. So doctors tend to listen to doctors, right? Yeah. So that's one thing they can do. But the other thing, as you know, and I'm sure your viewers know, there are referral networks available now, like through the Spiritual Emergence Network and through Assist, where people can find referrals for therapists in their area that are aware about STEs. I think this is really important. It just happened to me, believe it or not, last week, again, where somebody called me desperately, and they were from the southern US, and they said, my son's had this experience. He's been diagnosed as having a manic episode, but I think it's a mystical experience. Can you find me somebody that would at least consider the possibility that this is an STE? And so I actually put him in touch with SEN, and I put him in touch with the Assist Referral Network. But I happened to have a colleague friend who I know who lived in his area that I was able to refer him to. And so now his son is being honored, as he should be, of having had a very, very powerful STE, which was misdiagnosed as a manic episode. So yes, it is absolutely still happening.
Yeah, I hear these stories, and there are so many people trying to navigate, and you address it in the book as well, where you talk about spiritual emergency,
Yes.
and like the graphs, that spiritual emergence versus the emergency, and that fuzzy line between, it's unclear, do I sit on this side? Do I sit on that side? Where does psychosis go in that bounds? Then once the medical, diagnosis comes in and medicine comes into the picture, things can become confused so easily. And so there are so many people out there really trying to navigate that mess, I guess.
Well, that's one of the things I address in my book, is the difference between STE, which is part of the spiritual emergence process, versus some sort of crisis in that, which is called a spiritual emergency, versus what is actually psychosis. And, as a medical doctor, I'm trained to make diagnoses, and we have diagnostic criteria. And my experience is if a doctor or psychiatrist, psychologist is really using the DSM diagnostic criteria correctly, they're going to be less likely to make a mistake in diagnosis. But it can still happen. Now, there's also this group of experiences, which I mentioned very briefly in the book. David Lukoff has written about this quite a bit, transient psychosis with mystical features, that there may be some people with a very, very powerful STE that actually do go psychotic for a period of time, psychotic by our Western parameters for it. But these people, from my experience and from what I've read, generally do tend to slip into a more grounded state if they're in a supportive environment. Now, that being said, people who slip into psychosis as part of their spiritual emergence or STE process and are given antipsychotic medications. The most common I've seen is people having a manic episode. So they're given some medication to stabilize their manic episode. That does not stop the spiritual process. It might ground the mania and help them get more grounded. This person should adopt some of the grounding strategies that I talk about in my book. Maybe moderate how much they're meditating, more walking, more contact with nature, etc., to get themselves really grounded and make sure they're eating an adequate, balanced diet, getting enough sleep. But they're not going to stop their process or harm their process because they were on an antipsychotic medication for a period of time. I want to make that really clear, that really, if there has been a psychotic episode, get the medical support. When you're grounded, hopefully you'll find a psychiatrist who'll be willing to watch you while you go off the medication to see how you do without it. And don't worry that because you've had a psychotic episode, that's going to stop your spiritual process. The medication will not stop it. It will ground you in the psychotic episode. Now, the other thing I want to mention is that people who have a bona fide psychiatric mental illness, say chronic schizophrenia, or they definitely have bipolar, it's relapsing. These people can also have an STE. They are different things. And I give an example in my book of one woman that came my way in my practice. She was a long-term chronic schizophrenic with auditory hallucinations, etc. Had been on many medications for many years. Tried to kill herself one Christmas, unfortunately, in a fit of depression. She had a classic near-death experience that she was able to vividly and accurately describe to me, where she went out of body when her body was unconscious. She went into the light. She was greeted by light beings of her departed loved ones. It was explained to her in the light and the love that she should not kill herself, that that when she went back to her body, that she should live out her days, that there's a purpose. And she said to me, I don't know what my purpose is, Dr. Kason. Maybe I'm going to teach somebody something one day. And when she said that, I felt like a jab in my heart, because she taught me that everybody can have an STE, even a person with a chronic psychiatric condition. They're not mutually exclusive. They're different things. Sometimes you get a blurring, but sometimes they are just completely different things. And I think we need to honor that too. Just because someone has a psychiatric diagnosis doesn't mean they can't have a powerful STE. You can have both.
That's so valuable. It's so valuable in discerning, different experiences that are out there for people. Thank you for that. Yeah, once a doctor, always a doctor. It's never left you.
Oh no, I'm still a doctor. I'm not practicing medicine anymore, but I'm still sharing what I've learned.
Yes. As I listen to you, I dream of a day when people can walk into a family doctor's office and have these kinds of conversations. That would be a good
one day
time on the planet.
There are a few around, but that planet's evolving, but slowly but surely.
Yeah.
But your efforts are helping, so continue your work to spread awareness too.
We're all drops in that big old ocean.
We are doing our little parts.
So I guess bring us up to speed then, Yvonne. That was then, and the STEs, the people that you were meeting with, defining what all of that is about, coming to that big umbrella term. And
Writing books.
Writing books, getting out there, spreading the word about it, educating people. And some things have happened
Yeah.
between then and now, and I would love to hear about that.
Well, there are several things that happened. Um, First off, in 1995, I had another very powerful near-death experience. So during that time, during the 90s, I was busy traveling all over the place talking about near-death experiences and spiritually transformative experiences, and particularly after my book, Farther Shores, came out, promoting my book all over. So I had been in Edmonton speaking to a group there about spiritually transformative experiences, and I was flying back to Toronto on a large commercial, Air Canada jet. We flew into bad weather, which happens in Canada a lot, and the plane got into trouble when it was trying to land. There were coyotes on the runway. So the pilot had to abort the landing when we were about to touch down. I know. Coyotes on the runway.
Canada.
Yeah. And but the plane did not have enough airspeed to rise again, because we were about to touch ground when he saw that the coyotes were in front of us on the runway, and we would hit them. And we were in an ice storm in a blizzard with heavy winds, and ice had formed on the wings, so the plane was really heavy. It didn't have enough airspeed, and so as the pilot slapped back the flaps and was racing the engines, trying to get the plane to rise up again, it shook with air turbulence, unbelievable turbulence, and everyone in the plane went, "Oh my God, we're going to crash! We're going to crash!" We're going hysterical, and I had like a aha revelation. I thought, oh, I get it. I'm going to die today. I was meant to survive that other plane crash, but I'm going to die today in this plane crash now that my book's out and that can continue doing its work. So I instantly, as a reflex and as a decision, consciously went into death. I immediately went into meditation. I'd learned that if you're going to die consciously, go as high as you can, go straight to the light, don't stop anywhere in between, just go as high as you can. And my only attachment was my young son. I asked the good Lord to protect my son, and I consciously went into death. I went deep into meditation, and instantly my near-death experience started. I found myself out of my body. I was traveling up through a vast expanse of space. And then I had a life review. It was like I re-experienced. It was like a pebble skipping along the surface of the water, like I was jumping through time. And what I re-experienced was 3 of my peak spiritual experiences that I'd had in my life. So that included my near-death experience in 1979, another mystical experience that I'd had at a time later in my life, that calling experience that I had that I told you about, the mystical experience. So it was like for a few seconds, there's no sense of time when you're on the other side. So for some period of timeless time, it was like I was back in my NDE in 1979, and I was back in the mystical experience, then I was back in the other mystical experience. And then suddenly I was through that, and I was going higher, higher, higher. It was getting lighter in the tunnel, and it had more of like a royal blue hue. So it didn't look black. It was like royal blue. And I'm rising up, 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 up as fast as I can. Then all of a sudden, boom, I was stopped in my tracks. And there in front of me appeared a being of light. And this was a translucent, luminescent being of blue, white light. So it was, she was the same sort of tones as the blue that was all around me. And this being of light was like nothing I had ever seen before. It was like an archetype. It seemed to be half male and half female. So female on one side, male on the other side. It seemed to have 4 arms, and they were all held in sort of postures. And then one of the legs was held up. And afterwards, I've seen pictures and sculptures of the dancing Shiva. It was sort of like, it looked sort of like that sort of a position. But this figure was definitely half female and half male. So on one side it was a female, on the other side it was a male, and luminescent blue being of light. And it was obstructing my path. I could go no further towards the light. And telepathically, she communicated to me, it is not your time. And bang, just like that, I was back in my body again. And the plane was still in turbulence, and the pilot had not been able to ascend it. But I guess my third eye was wide open as I became aware of myself in the plane, and people were screaming and throwing up and crying. I could see like hands of light. I could see hands of light holding the plane through the turbulence. And somehow the pilot managed to eventually get the plane to ascend. And then we circled around, and he explained that he had to abort the landing because of the coyotes. And as when the runway's clear, he'd come back and land, which he successfully did. Well, that near-death experience was even more powerful and more transformative than the experience I had in the crash in 1979. When I got home that day, I had to go through the airport, get my luggage, get home. I felt like I had no skin. It was like there was no boundary separating me from everything that was around me. It was like we were somehow, there was no division. We were all connected. And I slept very deeply that night. And the next morning when I woke up, I was in a unitive state of consciousness. I was home. I knew what I was experiencing. There's nobody who had to explain to me what I was experiencing. I felt like there was no top to the top of my head, that where the top of my head used to be, I was directly connected to the universal ocean of consciousness. And in that state of awareness, in that state of communion, I was also totally aware, because I could see it, feel it, experience it, that every soul on this planet is connected, just as connected as I was. The only difference was that I was able to perceive it now, and other people are not able to perceive it. We are all connected, like waves of the same ocean, is how Paramahansa Yogananda says it. We just don't realize it, but I realized it, and I felt it, and I was living it. And in that state, I carried on my everyday life. There is this saying, before enlightenment, chopping wood and hauling water. After enlightenment, chopping wood and hauling water. Well, that's exactly what it was like. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell anybody for years about this, but now I feel it's time to share this, to let people know that this is what happened, that this can happen. I knew in this state of consciousness, it was profound. I went to my office. I would be counseling my STE patients. They would walk in the door. I would look at them, and I would instantly know through this profound, unbelievably fast intuition. I would absolutely know before they told me what the issues were that they were grappling with and how I could best help them work through it. And it's impossible to explain. I just knew. I would know ahead of time. I just knew. And it was profound. It was wonderful. It was home. It was what I have been seeking ever since that time, to regain that state of consciousness. Now, as time moved on, the expansive consciousness started shrinking, and I would have to meditate. I would have to still my mind, put my attention here, and meditate. And then whoop, I would pop back into the expansive state. So I learned experientially that meditation is the crucial key to get us into this expansive state of consciousness. Mm-hmm. But gradually over the 2 months, it became more and more difficult for me to hold the expanded state. And I would have to meditate more in order to re-enter that unitive state. And then finally, I look at it, my karma caught up with me, I guess. Finally, after 2 months, I was no longer able to enter that unitive state of consciousness. So this experience propelled me into a completely new life stage. So professionally, I definitely continued with my work counseling STE experiencers, traveling around spreading awareness about STEs. But personally, as a spiritual seeker, my spiritual life became incredibly important to me. I yearned desperately. I had like a yearning in my soul to regain, to come back to home, to that unitive state of consciousness. And I knew that meditation was going to be my key for getting there. Anyway, so I became a very devoted and intense spiritual seeker in addition to my medical practice. And my inner life increasingly became more important to me than my outer professional life. It was my deepening inner communion that was the most important thing for me. And then November the 8th, 2003, which is when I had my fourth near-death experience, things changed again. I know.
You're still here.
Well, the good Lord keeps sending me back. I guess
Wow.
I've got more work to do or more karma to burn off or both. Anyway, so on November the 8th, 2003, I had a slip and fall accident. And before it happened, I had been meditating. I was actually in Niagara Falls, which is a wonderful power place. I love meditating there. I find the roar of the falls creates like the Om vibration. And so I go very, very deep in my meditation. So one of my favorite places to meditate is actually in the tunnels underneath the falls. So I was meditating down there on the tunnels underneath the falls that evening. And I had a profound, wonderful, deep meditation. And I re-entered that state of communion. And I thought, oh, finally. I had no idea how long that communion would last, but I knew, having found my way back once, even if it only lasted for a little while, I would somehow be able to find my way back again. So in that incredible state of communion, I went up after my meditation. I was with a friend. We had dinner there overlooking the falls. There was a full moon eclipse happening that night, the Harmonic Concordance, they called it. My astrologist told me that something was going to happen to me that night that would propel me forward spiritually. I had no idea what that would be, but I thought, interesting. So we had dinner, and then after dinner, we went out to take a final look at the falls before we went back to the car to drive back home to Toronto. Now, during the time that we were in having dinner, the temperature had dropped, and so the mist of the falls had frozen over the walkway. And when I went out to look at the falls, I slipped on some black ice, which you may not know what that is in Australia, but that's ice that you can't see, black ice. It's totally invisible. And it was at night, and I couldn't see it. I slipped and it fell backwards, hit my head directly on stone. It was a stone cobblestone walkway, and I died. And what happened is medically is I had a traumatic brain injury with a brain hemorrhage. What I experienced inwardly, there was first this horrible sensation like someone taking an axe to my head, excruciating pain. And then poof, my spirit was out of my body, and I was whisking through the darkness, and almost in an instant or two, I was up in the realm of white light again. And I was greeted by two beings of light, two great saints that I know and recognize from my spiritual tradition. And it was telepathically explained to me that I had died. And the feeling was of incredible celebration and joy. It was like a university graduation party. You made it, you finished it, you're all through. So it was this sort of jubilant arrival, jubilant celebration that my work as Dr. Yvonne Kason was finished and I was now on the other side, and, you know, well done. And you know, everybody makes mistakes in their lives, but none of my mistakes or flaws were even mentioned. They seemed to be irrelevant in the love, the unconditional love of the light. It was wonderful. And I had much revealed to me when I was in the light. And it wasn't like linearly, you know, this being explained or that being explained. It's more like a veil being removed, and suddenly you see the whole tapestry with all kinds of details. And I could see in a flash, instantly, how my many past lives all fit together and all wove together, leading up to what I considered rather oddball life as Dr. Yvonne Kason, with all these incredible STEs and near-death experiences. It was like, oh, I see how that all fits together. I understand now. It was like an aha. I see how my lives all fit together. I see. It makes sense now why I had the kind of incarnation that I did. Anyway, I was in that ecstasy in the light for what I call timeless time. And then the gurus, the saints who had welcomed me, appeared in front of me in their light bodies again and telepathically communicated to me, you may now choose. So that actually means you must now choose. You may now choose whether to return to serve Divine Mother in the body of a babe, or to return to the maimed body of Dr. Yvonne Kason to serve Divine Mother there. And you see, for me, this is perfect, because at that time in my life, I was relating to God in terms of Divine Mother. And my prayer was always, make me your instrument. I want to be your instrument, Divine Mother. Make me your instrument. So to be given the choice to serve Divine Mother here or decide to serve Divine Mother there was the perfect choice for my soul. Anyway, in that state of ecstasy, intellect is sort of gone. And it was my soul, it was my heart that responded. It felt like it was my heart that was responded. Because before I even had time to think, my heart responded, please guide me. What's the better choice? I want to do God's will. And so lovingly, like just so lovingly, like a gentle caress, the thought comes back into my consciousness. You can choose. So implied in that was that both choices were good. But my heart again responded, please guide me. Please guide me. What is the higher choice? And so again, with exquisite sweetness, how a thought can have sweetness is indescribable, but it was a thought with incredible sweetness came to me. It will be more difficult, but to return to the maimed body. Now, just so you know, maimed was not in my vocabulary. I had to look it up after I got back. And maimed means disabled or with a disability. Mm-hmm. So I was told to return to the body. And my heart and soul instantly responded, I accept. But faster than the speed of thought. So between the word I and the word accept is when I woke up in my previously dead body. So when I thought I was in the light with the saints, and then there was a gasp of breath like this, and suddenly I'm in my ice cold, because it was winter, cold, frozen, dead body, gasping life back into it. And then I thought, accept. And then for the first few minutes where I was now breathing life back into my previously dead body, I could see both realities at the same time. I could see the physical reality of the world around me. My friend, Yvonne, are you all right? And I could also see the light realm superimposed, the two realities superimposed upon each other, and the two beings of light. It's like they ushered me back, as well as welcoming me there into the light. They ushered me back. But slowly the light realm disappeared. It was like that split screen TV again, and the second image got smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller until finally I was here. But I always felt there was like just a little dot of the other side there. And that little dot of the other side was so powerful and healing for me as I faced all the worldly challenges I had to face, having had a serious traumatic brain injury. So that injury with the near-death experience disabled me from practicing medicine. I was unable to practice as a medical doctor anymore. And I tried intensely with neuro rehab for many years, for about 7 years, because I so loved what I did, but it simply was impossible. So I officially retired from medical practice in 2006. And I accepted that for whatever reason in the divine plan, that I was now to live my life as a disabled person, as a person with a disability. And burning off karma, helping other people burn off karma, that I'm to use my energy, spiritual energy now in praying for other people, in meditating and sending prayers and good wishes to other people. So that's how I came to understand that this is now what my life is, that spiritually God wants me to be in the back of the scenes and to be praying for others, meditating for others, but I won't be out on the front lines anymore. So I accepted that. I absolutely knew from my near-death experience that this was not any sort of punishment or bad karma, which some people said rather hurtfully. No, God's plan is perfect. I didn't know why it was. I didn't need to know why I was. I mean, it's arrogant to need to know all the reasons in God's plan. I mean, we can't possibly understand God's plan, but I just trusted it. I accepted it. And I knew that God loved me, and I knew this was not a punishment. And I all the time in my healing journey, I do plan to write a book all about my healing journey, but I wanted to focus on the positive. I wanted to see the good. And I mean, my goodness, I've been blessed by 4 near-death experiences and a Kundalini awakening and mystical experiences. And so becoming disabled and having chronic fatigue and fibromyalgia and dizziness and all these problems I deal with, that doesn't negate any of the rest of it. It's just, more stuff I have to do. So anyway, I had totally let go of my professional life, and I thought my book Farther Shores, which you've shown a few times, that was my testimonial and people could read it, but that my work was not in the world anymore. But then, much to my surprise, Spirit had more work for me to do, because about 2 years ago, so that was February 24th, 2016, when I was in a long meditation, in a meditation retreat down in Encinitas, California, I had a spontaneous healing experience, another type of STE. So basically what happened that day, I was in a long, deep meditation. I'd been meditating already maybe for a few hours, and I'd been at the retreat already for several days. So I'd been doing long meditations for several days already. And suddenly, in the middle of this meditation, I experienced an eruption in the center of my brain. It was like a fountain of light erupted and started flowing in the middle of my brain. So this was like an inner vision of etheric inner light. So there was a fountain of light flowing in the middle of my brain, and it had an effect that felt like a part of my brain that had been in darkness for 12 years since I had my brain injury. Suddenly the lights came on, and the fountain was illuminating that part of my brain. And at the same time that this happened, it just felt like a part of my brain woke up. And I felt inspired creativity flowing through me like a fastly flowing river. It was like all the ideas that had been inside of me. It's like a 12-year pregnancy. All the ideas that have been inside of me for 12 years, that if I was ever well enough to write, I'd like to write about these things. All of a sudden the floodgates open and the ideas were just flooding through my consciousness and flooding through my consciousness and I was just amazed when I finished my meditation. I was writing like crazy in my journal, all the ideas that I got, and I didn't know, geez, this is a temporary healing or a temporary inspiration, but no, it has been sustained. This has been a sustained brain healing. After I had that healing, it was like this part of my brain is now alive, well, and healthy. My inspired creativity has completely healed, and perhaps more healed than it even was, more expansive than it was before I had the brain injury. So in the first year after the healing, I've written 2 new books, and I'm currently looking for a publisher for my 2 new books. Still haven't found the right one, but hopefully soon. And I have other books inside of me. I literally feel like my consciousness is pregnant, and I'm wanting to birth. There are other books in my consciousness that want to come. Actually, the next one I'm planning to write is my healing journey from traumatic brain injury, striving to thrive. Just survival is not enough.
I can't wait. I can't wait to read these. And how do you as a medical doctor explain a spontaneous healing?
Well, there are different healings. By coincidence, again, if you believe in coincidence, I spoke with one of the world's great experts on brain neuroplasticity a few months after I had the healing. He wanted to talk to me about Kundalini. Well, I wanted to speak to him about brain neuroplasticity. So he said to me, well, Yvonne, I think all of your meditation that you did all of the years, over the years, and your deep meditation stilled the brain noise that after any sorts of brain traumas, and actually with a lot of conditions of the brain, even autism and things like that, they have something called brain noise, where the brain is firing chaotically because it's trying to get itself to function properly, but it can't because there are blocks or barriers by whatever disorder is in there. So he said that you calmed your brain and the brain noise, and that they've now discovered that with meditation, by calming the brain, it creates the environment that stimulates brain neuroplasticity. It actually stimulates the brain to heal and to build new pathways to go around the injured pathways, or to go areas, or to go through the injured areas, or nobody really knows. But somehow meditating stimulates brain neuroplasticity. So all those years when I was intently focusing on my meditation, I was stimulating my brain neuroplasticity. Well, that would be his explanation. I also think that, so I think it's a testimonial that the brain can heal. We just don't know how to heal the brain. So we're learning very slowly. We're just beginning infancy steps of figuring out how to get the brain to heal. But I'm a living testimonial. The brain can heal, even 12 years after a serious injury. So secondly, I think it's a real testimonial to the healing power of meditation. So this doctor gave me his view on meditation. But you and I both know that meditation also stimulates the Kundalini. Meditation also stimulates the transformative energy. So was that eruption of light that I saw in my consciousness, was that Kundalini? I don't know. But it definitely was a fountain of light. It was on the astral planes, it was not on the physical plane. So who knows? The third layer of this healing, the third level of this healing, is the grace of God. Because I think that's probably the most powerful part of, or factor in my brain healing, that somehow in the divine plan, the divine had more work for me to do. Divine wanted me to start writing books again and doing talks like talking to you today, and IANs and assist where I'm going to be talking later on this year. And so the divine healed me and said, okay, Yvonne, time to get back to work. You've had your 12 years of meditating, and now time to get you out there again. So
Wow.
I look at it as all three, but above all, it's the grace of God and the great gurus that are helping us from the other side.
Well, I give so much thanks that you made the choice to re-enter the maimed body at that point in time, even though it be the more difficult path at that point. And to still be here now after all of that, and to have an even stronger voice, I would imagine, to step forward with at a time where science and spirit do seem in many ways to be having a wonderful conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do feel much freer now. Now that I've retired from the practice of medicine, I don't have to be worried about being put over hoops or judged by the medical profession about what I have to say. I really feel now I can speak openly, I can speak freely. Things that I was perhaps cautious about talking about before, I'm now speaking openly. I'm sharing my calling mystical experience. I'm sharing my Kundalini awakening. I'm sharing all of these experiences, not to brag or show off, not at all, but to just share with other people. This can happen to you too. And it doesn't mean you're crazy if this is happening to you. This does happen to some people on the spiritual path. This is part of the spiritual transformation process. You might have multiple mystical experiences, multiple near-death experiences, multiple peak Kundalini experiences. We don't know. Everybody's journey is different. I'm sharing mine as a support to other people who are on the spiritual journey out there, that they are not alone. This does not mean you're going crazy. And yes, there is a final outcome that is possible. I've glimpsed it. I'm not there yet. But what we read in all the books about unitive consciousness, about God communion, it is possible. And it's possible for ordinary people. We just have to keep on keeping on, keep on striving.
Well, people, stay tuned, because this force that is Dr. Yvonne Kason is going to be getting a bit of airtime. You haven't heard it. You haven't heard it all yet at all. There's going to be a lot more coming, and it's wow, what an exciting time. We must have you back on here.
Well, thank you.
Things evolve and as new works come out and different messages come out as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
As we wrap up, Yvonne, and thank you so much for sharing your story and all of those layers, and such a holistic picture of a journey of an experiencer in this earthly lifetime and what is possible as a human being, human evolving. As we come to a close, is there anything you feel at this point in time that is important to share with people out there that you just want people to know? Yes,
I would say the most important thing is meditate. If you're not doing it already, start a daily practice of meditation and try to live a grounded, balanced life. You don't have to be off in the forest. You don't have to go into an ashram. You can be in the world and contributing to the world, but strive to lead a balanced life and meditate. And this spiritual transformation will carry you home. Gopi Krishna once said, the Kundalini, which sometimes they refer to her as the goddess Shakti, she knows her way home.
Yeah. Thank you for being the vessel that you are, Yvonne.
You're welcome.
It is truly a pleasure and an honor to connect, and I look forward to much more.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Namaste. Namaste.